Hello and welcome to Still Unbelievable. We're back. I'm your host, David Johnson, the skeptic, and I'm joined by my Christian counterpart.
Yep, so I'm Dale, representing the Christian or seeker side on Skeptics and Seekers. Not Still Unbelievable, but yeah, they're both good shows.
Hey, what show did I just introduce?
Still Unbelievable.
That's really embarrassing. That's often, a good host and editor would just cut that out and start over again. Screw that. So here's what we're gonna do. As it turns out, we've got someone in the third chair again. Wow, who do we have in the third chair, Dale?
Yes, we have Natalie Collins. Woohoo! Welcome to the show, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
I think that's probably what was on my mind because the last time I had Natalie on, she was on Still Unbelievable. You can find that episode. It's on the internet. Maybe I'll link to it. Maybe I won't. Did I mention I'm not a really good host? So
he's good.
It might. So it might be there. But yeah. So she was occupying the third chair then, and I can say with predictive power that chair for Natalie will be more comfortable than this chair. This is one of those crappy folding tin chairs that's kind of beaten up and it's tilted forward. I mean, she was in a nice Aeron chair before. This is not going to be quite as comfortable. But that's because we've got some serious things to talk about, and they're really hard. If we had, say, two Christians on the show, they would probably find very few points of agreement. As it happens, we do have two Christians on the show, so we'll get a chance to test that theory a little bit. But this is hard. It's hard for Christians to talk about with each other, and it's hard for Christians to talk about with non-Christians. And so we're going to be diving into something that's a little bit difficult and a little bit challenging, and I think that we'll all come out better off for it. Especially our audiences. We're going to be talking about how God communicates with us, how God communicates generally and specifically, and the theology of it and the experience of it. So, tough stuff. Before we get into that, Natalie, I'm going to hand you the mic and just briefly tell our listeners who the heck you are.
So I'm based in the UK, about 45 minutes from London. I describe myself as a gender justice specialist, which is a title I made up to encompass all the different things that I do. I work on lots of issues around male violence, pornography, some stuff around gender identity, lots of different stuff. And I have a book coming out like this week, which is quite exciting, for Christians about domestic abuse, called Out of Control. So that's me.
Okay. And let me tell you guys, I like Natalie Collins a lot. I liked her before I invited her on to Unbelievable when I first heard her. And I like her now. And so even if this discussion doesn't necessarily reflect that, I just want to say up front, this is a person that I really enjoy. I think she's doing some good and important work. And we will include links to her good and important work in the show notes. Natalie, why don't you go ahead and give a shout out to one or two things that you might want to plug?
So I guess the book's the main thing. I'll send a link over to you for people to get it. And my broader website is nataliecollins.info if people want to look at my work. And I tweet as God Loves Women on Twitter. So anybody who wants to say hi on Twitter, that's where I shall be.
Okay. All right. So with that in mind, let's jump right in. Dale, you want to kick off with the first question?
Sure. Natalie, obviously, our topic today is about, what are some of the ways that God chooses to communicate with us, and what is the theology behind divine revelation? So, in the first place, I think one of the first places Christians should look to understand how God communicates is in the Bible. So, Just out of curiosity, what do you think are some of the ways that the Bible says God uses to reveal information to us?
Um, so I would say you have very explicit, direct revelation visible throughout Scripture. So a lot of the prophets experience God telling them things very explicitly. Saul on the road to Damascus has this blinding light and these audible words being spoken to him. You have people being spoken to in dreams. You have people like Peter seeing this vision while he's awake of the blanket coming down and giving him information about who was allowed into the faith that he hadn't previously understood. So it's almost there seems to be some stuff around when God wants to say something important, doing it in very direct ways. But also, if you look in the Old Testament, when they found the word of God, after the exile, and you kind of read in either Ezra or Nehemiah or maybe both of them, when they discover the word of God again and they read that, so you actually see how the word of God speaks to people. There's people who speak to people. So Moses, God speaks to Moses directly, but then Moses shares that information with God's people. So there's lots of different ways. I don't think there's only one way it's shown.
So I thought about a lot of the very same things that you just mentioned. In fact, Dale and I are sharing some notes, and it's almost as if you have a copy of our notes because you said these things almost in the order that we put them in. I think the only thing that you didn't mention is preachers. God uses preachers, and I'm guessing that you would put that in the category of prophets, the way you describe prophets. Could you just maybe expand on your definition of what a prophet is?
So I suppose I was thinking like Old Testament prophet. So when God wanted to say something to his people about generally how badly they were doing, usually he would call somebody to have this kind of word. Often would involve doing odd things like cooking food over feces, or walking around naked, or lying on one side or the other side. So you have like these kind of quite prophetic acts that thankfully God doesn't seem to be calling anyone to do today. So I think that's quite different than the sort of prophecy that you would see in the New Testament, and probably how it would be understood by most Christians today, which would be much more kind of words of wisdom or knowledge that God gives to somebody for another person.
So I just find it interesting. One second, Dale. You just used prophetic as a synonymous with insane. You're talking about, these prophetic acts, and I'm thinking, yeah, that fits with insane perfectly. So, I don't know if you realize you did that.
Out of curiosity though, Natalie, so yeah, I think you are right to point out that there are multiple ways that God uses in the Bible to communicate with different people. But you sort of hinted, some of these means were for back then. So is there a difference between certain methods that he used in the Bible that you don't think God uses today?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't come across anyone recently who's felt God's called them to cook food over feces and then eat them to present something that he wants to say to the people of God. So I think, that's just one example. I think that there's a lot less kind of pronouncing to the people of God, but I think that's probably about the development of the narrative of the people of God, and where the people of God now isn't solely the Jewish people anymore. It's a much more diverse, and it's not one people group who all kind of inherit from the same source, if you like. It's a much more broader thing. So I think in that sense we've seen how God speaks and who God speaks to being quite different, particularly that actually in the Old Testament, God spoke through the priests and the prophets, and the New Testament suggests that kind of Holy Spirit and that gift of being able to hear is open to everyone, not just to certain special people. So that's, I guess, where we see the biggest difference, is the shift from chosen people hearing from God and bringing it to the rest of the people of God, to the idea that we all have access to the Holy Spirit speaking to us.
So definitionally, I don't disagree with you there, but I use a more generic definition of prophet that might come up later. So it's fair to you and the audience for you to know what I mean when I say prophet, just as they understand what you mean when you say prophet. And maybe we can come up with some agreement there. But if there's some later disagreement due to this misunderstanding, it might be because we're using different definitions of the word. So when I used to think of prophecy in the way that I think most people think of prophecy, which is kind of a fortune telling. What's the test of a prophet? That they're accurate 100% of the time. Well, what do we mean by accurate? We're talking about fortune telling. They say something is going to happen and then it happens. So that is one biblical definition of prophet, frankly. It's not the only definition of prophet, though. The reason I think those who foresaw the future were prophets is not because they were foreseeing the future, but because God was talking to them. That's the thing that made them a prophet. So they were a prophet whether God was telling them something about the future, or in the case of Moses and the Pentateuch, telling them something about the past. That's still prophecy, in that God is giving direct information to that person. And so by the same token, a person says to another person, you are an adulteress and you have, you're living with someone who's not your husband. Well, they're not telling the future, but they are speaking prophetically. And what makes it prophetic is because they're giving information that God gave them and that they couldn't get from anywhere else. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say prophet. I'm not thinking of any one instantiation of that gift. I'm thinking of generically, this is a person who God talks to about things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's problematic to kind of say prophet is synonymous with predictor of the future, because I think where we see people in the Bible prophesying about a future time, the purpose is to reveal something of God's plan or something about what God is saying to those people. So if it was like, you're going to go into exile, the purpose of that was to help the people of God to make better choices. Do you know what I mean? So the future is sort of, it's not the most significant part of it, I think, is what you're saying too, is that, kind of prediction and foreseeing may come into it, but that's kind of a byproduct of it rather than the primary goal.
Okay. Dale?
Cool. So, I guess, so out of curiosity then, so in terms of confirming or disconfirming, so I think I agree 100% with what you say, Natalie. Prophecy isn't just about predicting the future necessarily. That could be something that's a byproduct that might be used to confirm that they are actually communicating with God. So I was just sort of wondering, with the various methods that Christians have, that God communicates with Christians today, do you think there are some ways that we can sort of check the validity or confirm that it's actually God versus disconfirm, if it's a false prophet or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a tricky one, because anybody in sort of charismatic Christian circles, so there are people who would hold to a cessationist theology, who wouldn't believe that God does talk to people now, so for those who don't hold that theology, those who do believe God speaks to us now, I think it's a tricky one, because I suppose I've been in Christian circles where somebody's having a prophecy might be someone saying that God loves you, or God thinks that you're brilliant, or so there's sort of generic words of wisdom that people might tell you God is giving you that you wouldn't really be able to deny, but equally doesn't speak directly to something going on in someone's life. And then on you kind of on the other side of that, somebody might be feeling very, very distressed, having lots of problems in their life, and actually that word helps them to kind of get through that time. So I think it's not that every more generic thing that you can't test hasn't got a value or is not real, but I think it's more complex when you get into, well, what are the things that God says to people today. I think in terms of the things that God has spoken to me directly, like those things are testable and are provable, that they've emerged as real things, that they've either happened or they were, they've become something that actually exists. Equally, there are times I was in a church, and it was years ago, and I'd only recently come back to being a Christian, and I was quite traumatized. I was dealing with lots of difficult issues, and this person had a word from God that I should stop watching TV and stop reading newspapers. And unbeknown to them, I didn't own a TV and I didn't read newspapers, and so yeah, absolutely. People don't, at that point you can go, no, you didn't hear that from God, you made that up. Like another time, I was part of this charismatic church movement where they did these things called prophecy pods, where you could go and you'd sit and there'd be a prayer and a writer, and the prayer would pray and then they'd work out what God was saying to you, and then the writer would write that down for you. So anyway, before I went, my husband said to me, he was like, if they can't think of anything to say, they'll say that they see a waterfall. So basically I went to this prophecy pod. They sat down and they got all into the zone, and then they started praying, and the first thing out of this woman's mouth was, I see a waterfall.
Your husband's a prophet.
Thank you. And I was like, I can't even. So I think my experience has been of a lot of these these places where people try to create a space for somebody to say something that God has said to them for you. Like, that hasn't been very useful. And when I kind of said to God, like, why can't you give me like words of knowledge from these people? And I felt God said to me that I wouldn't listen to them anyway, because unless God gives me that information directly, I would just be like, well, it's probably not real anyway. So that's my personal experience of words that were not accurate.
So if I can follow up on that, I think that you've answered the question very well, but I'd like to maybe look at it from the other side of the lens. So maybe you are talking about how you can know, and we'll talk about this too, how you can know whether a word of God you received is accurate or not. And obviously when people say falsifiable things, then you can know that, whether they're telling the truth or not. But that still doesn't tell you whether it's from God or not. So a person can guess at a thing and be right about it, and that doesn't mean that it came from God. And so I'm curious about how the outsider looks at these things. So, for instance, like preachers, if God communicates to people via preachers, how is the outsider supposed to know which preacher they should listen to? I mean, they can't listen to all of them. They're all saying different things. And, how are they supposed to know which prophets are true prophets from God and which aren't? And, how are they supposed to know, whether the Bible is actually a true thing or not? I mean, they're outsiders, remember, so they don't have a faith position on the Bible. Is there a way that you think that these things can be used in an well, I'll just leave it there.
Did you mean how could the idea that God speaks to people be accessible to those who don't believe in God?
Yeah. So if God is using these methods to talk to people, there must be a way for people to verify that this is in fact God talking to them.
Well, I think for a start, for people who don't believe in God, like I think it's very difficult for that to be to verify something that you don't believe in. So like there is kind of a sense of confirmation bias. So if you don't believe in it, then you're going to automatically assume it's not true. And if you do believe in it, you're automatically going to assume it's true. Like just so I think there are tricky things about that. I think in terms of like, well, which preachers do you listen to? I suppose my experience of preachers saying something that I feel comes from God, it's actually just been about where I am. So when I go to church on a Sunday, it may be that just one thing that preacher says speaks to something that's going on in my life. But it's not that I have to go seeking out and listening to hours and hours of sermons to hope that I find the one that God speaks to me through. I think that the place that I find myself in is the place though where God will speak to me, rather than me kind of trying to discern that. And actually somebody who, I've preached before and people have come up to me and said, oh, like this thing that you said really spoke to me. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even remember saying that. So I don't think it's necessarily as clear as that. Like there's these words that the preacher has planned to say and they know that they're going to speak to somebody directly. It may just be a throwaway comment that then speaks to somebody that something is going on in their lives. But I think there has to be some sort of openness to actually I might get something from here, because if somebody's really close to all of that, then they're not necessarily gonna have their heart or mind open to the potential of it.
Yeah, that's a good thing that you said there, because I was just sort of thinking, in your opinion, does God ever communicate with non-believers at any times? And if he does, in certain cases, you sort of answered this. Are there any conditions that the skeptic that the non-believer has to meet in order for God to communicate with them? So, such as being open-minded, like you said.
I think, we've all heard, well, we might not have all have heard, but I know I've heard of testimonies of lots of people who, generally my experience has been of testimonies of non-Christians who have had direct revelation from God. There has been some sort of openness to that, so some sort of hitting rock bottom, or an openness to spirituality. So we hear, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but there are stories that come out from parts of the world about people of other faiths having visions of Jesus speaking to them, or dreams of Jesus speaking to them in places where they would have never had access to, like the Bible or anything like that. So there are those sorts of stories which come out and emerge, but there is a commonality of some sort of openness, but I wouldn't want to like relegate anybody who is not open that God couldn't speak to them, because God is bigger than where we are in all of this. So I think God can break through those things, but there's something about consent that actually, if we are not willing to engage with the potential, the God of, there's that whole thing of God asks our permission, and if we are not willing to engage with this and we shut down any potential of this being a possibility, then like God's not going to kind of violate us by insisting on pushing himself on us if we don't want to know.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah. So I've heard that a lot, and I just personally, I find it unconvincing, because if we don't really know what we need to know. We have our experiences dictate kind of where we are in our life and what we believe right now and what we are open to and what we think is just outrageous. And so if God has a higher truth that can transcend our experiences, He can't use our limited experiences as a way in. If the best, if as an unbeliever, I am lost because God chose not to present to me in a way that was convincing, because He said, well, you're not open. Well, okay, but I'm not open because I've lived a life where I've been surrounded. Let's say I lived a life surrounded by religious frauds. Mm. Well, that's not my fault that I've lived a life surrounded by religious frauds, and it's not entirely fair to say, well, you ought to stay open because one day someone will talk religion to you that's not a fraud. Well, that's not really fair. So it's really kind of up to God to break through that. If He's got a message that transcends my circumstances, to transcend my circumstances of hearing it, He can't send just another guy that sounds like a religious fraud to me and say, well, I sent you a preacher.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you use the word lost, because I suppose I would say that I don't think the fact that God, people don't hear from God directly doesn't make them lost. It means that they don't hear from God directly at this present time. And I believe the other side of eternity, we'll all be able to get hold of God directly. I don't think that that'll only be limited to the people who made a decision this side. So I suppose I would say I think that absolutely I have total sympathy and understanding for people for whom God is ruined because of Christians and people of, whether it's Christians or other people who have just wrecked somebody's capacity to be open to God, because if we've been abused or damaged in any way, that their need is to protect ourselves and to not remain vulnerable to that kind of stuff. So I think that that God is for those people who are broken, and if we have been broken because of religious trauma or because of what's been done to us in that way, I think that grace says that there's nobody's lost at all. Just to say that.
All right. So Dale, I'm just going to say, because I have the equivalent of jet lag, permanent jet lag, I am counting on you to keep us on track.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So great. Yeah. I've been checking off some of the things that we've been doing. So sticking to the list for you there, David. But yeah, I just wanted to say on my end, I appreciated that answer there, Natalie. It does actually resonate with me. So, this is one of the things that David and I have gone back and forth on. But I do believe that one has to be a real seeker, and then it's on God. God will reveal the truth to them before the point of no return. So that, you're right to point out that might not be before at the moment of death. It could be in the afterlife that you're given an opportunity to be saved or something like that. But one thing I did want to ask you about, so sort of going more on an epistemological level. So you mentioned God communicates with some people through dreams and that sort of thing, and that leads to their conversion. They believe and they claim to have knowledge that Christianity is true. So what would you say in the first place if a skeptic's like, yeah, but dreams are a very unreliable way for coming to a knowledge of truth. You shouldn't rely on that. It was just a random dream. Like in the first place, how would you come back to a challenge like that?
I suppose in the first instance, I would be like, yes, I agree. I don't think you can rely solely on a dream, but actually it's how that dream impacts us when we're not asleep anymore, or when, if we have like Peter had a vision that suddenly he felt very convicted of something that previously he would have found absolutely horrendous, an abomination to him, that after he has this dream, has this vision, he's suddenly like, oh, I should go to these Gentiles' houses and I should see them as Christians, and so there is a huge transformation and a huge a changing of his perspective in a very radical way. So I think it's not the dream is the visible, if you like, representation of a greater change that.
Okay, cool. I think
they're kind of operating out that, and then seeing where does that road take us? Does that road take us to somewhere healthy and positive, or does it take us somewhere problematic? And then the fruit of it would be how we would test it, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you are you familiar with the notion of properly basic beliefs at all, or the inner witness of the Holy Spirit? Obviously, you would know about that. One thing that I see, so it's not necessarily so much about the experience itself. It could be through a dream, or maybe God communicates through an audible voice, or there's different ways God could communicate. But so long as that person, that experience grounds knowledge, it results from that, from a properly basic belief. So we have a warranted true belief that comes attached to the experience that God is using as a means to communicate to us. That's how I would say we can actually know that, yes, when Peter had the vision and saw this change in the food laws and that sort of thing, he knew God was communicating to him through a properly basic belief, rather than having to test it through future works. Do you see any validity in that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I suppose it did get tested though, didn't it? So it didn't just exist in isolation, that it became tested in that he then went to these people's house. It wasn't just the dream, it was then the fact that these people whose house he went to, he saw them, the Holy Spirit fall on them, and then he went to Jerusalem and had to account for his understanding of what God was saying in front of other people, and then those other people accepted that this was God. So I think anything that is God, it doesn't sit in isolation, that we are community beings, and that if somebody just has an idea to do something and says it's from God, that's the start of cults usually.
Yes.
So following up on that, Dale mentioned properly basic beliefs as one of the ways of knowing. Now, when Dale talks about properly basic belief, what I really hear him saying is, well, you know because you know. That's very circular, and also that's very reductive. Dale will talk for 3 days on properly basic belief.
I've never heard of this term before, so it isn't. The idea of properly basic belief is, I don't know. I mean, I probably understand the concept of it, but it's not something I'm familiar with.
It comes from Plantinga, so a Christian philosopher.
Okay.
Yeah. So I acknowledge I'm being very reductive of Dale's take on Plantinga. I also think it's fair to say Plantinga himself would disagree with Dale on where Dale takes Plantinga's ideas. That said, let's just set that aside for a moment, because that is one way of explaining how does direct revelation work. So I obviously don't think we get anywhere by saying, well, you know because you know. So let me ask you, Natalie, because you have had some experience with direct revelation. We'll talk about that. How does it work? Is it an audible voice? Is it a feeling? Is it an irresistible inclination? How would you describe it?
So I've been trying to work out how to describe it for this, and I hopefully my articulation will be useful to everybody. I hope. So I think probably the first time that I sort of begin to sort of pinpoint the time when God started to speak to me directly, because I was one of those people who would have never seen myself as the sort of person God would speak to me directly. I was raised with my parents were Christians, but they were quite they relied on God for financial provision, but they were not a fan of the charismatic gifts at all. So I was raised with very cynical around that stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with the Toronto blessing stuff. My parents saw the really problematic side of that in the 80s and I don't know if it was the 80s or the early 90s, but yeah. So I wasn't somebody who really thought God would ever speak to me. But then I found myself going through a load of really horrific stuff that led to me living in a hospital with a premature baby and a toddler as a single parent. And it was from that place that I began to experience this God that I'd heard about and that I'd grown up with this understanding was real, actually doing things and saying things to me. And at first I suppose the first thing was this sense that I should read the Bible a lot, that I should shut out other forms of media. And so for a little while, I was living in a hospital. I wasn't part of a church at this point, so I just started reading the Bible a lot and noting down every question that I had, and that's what I did alongside living in this hospital. And then I had this the first thing that I remember God really directly saying to me is that I needed to stop praying for my son to live and start praying for God's will to be done, and to stop asking, to basically ask for God's will to be done, and to believe and to understand in that situation that I would love God the same whether my son lived or died, which, in a in a podcast that's going to be listened to by atheists, I know it's not really selling the Christian faith right now, but bear with it.
You're doing fine.
I was living in this hospital, and I came into contact with this God who wasn't giving me any hope, who wasn't saying, "Don't worry, I'm the magical fairy godmother, I will make all your wishes come true," but was saying, "You need to love me no matter what." And I'd come out of a situation with my ex-husband, who was very abusive to me, and he had actually prevented me from having any connection, any kind of spirituality or any faith, because somebody who's abusive tries to strip you of anything that gives you strength. And so when I lived on without God, really, and had found it to be so awful, not because of the abuser involved, that I just thought, I can't actually do this on my own, and whether he does live or die, I can do it if I can do it with this God who's being present with me. So in that space, I chose to say, well, I'll your will be done. And actually Joshua did get better. He's now 13, and he has some behavioral issues, but yeah, so that was my kind of first experience of God speaking to me, very and I suppose in terms of what did it actually present as, it was definitely, it wasn't audible in the fact, it wasn't like I heard a voice that I thought everybody else could hear. It was that I heard these words that came from within me that seemed to be from outside of me, saying that this thing that made so much sense, even though it was absolutely illogical, that in the core of my being, I was like, yes, I get that, even though it was totally illogical and seemed to be particularly not good news at all for me. And so I suppose that was the first time, and then from there I started to kind of hear God saying and doing more things for me. So a few months, well, maybe about 6 or so months later, I was stood talking to a guy I'd known for about 6 years, and the same thing happened. This sort of audible thing inside of me that I knew was this God speaking to me, but was not something I didn't think, oh, this is like everybody can hear this, but this voice and these words inside of me that felt like they came from outside of me. And they said, you're going to marry him. The friend of mine is called Baggy, and I was like, I am not going to marry him. Like, I didn't want to marry anyone, and I definitely didn't want to marry him because he was like 13 years older than me, and I was like, he is really old. I was 23 at this time, or 22, and and so for 18 months, the more that I was like, I don't want to marry him, the more that I felt like that was going to be the best outcome for my life. So there was firstly this like audible voice that was inside me but felt like it was outside me, that came with this kind of sense of like a growing conviction that seemed at odds with my actual feelings about this situation. And in the end, I said to God, well, you're going to have to tell him, because I am not telling him. If this is really God's going to have to do it, because I'm not having that conversation. And Baggy had been single for about 13 years. He didn't think he'd get married or have kids. He was quite happy with that, which is odd for most Christians, as they're all, ready to get married very quickly, aren't they? And so he was like, chilling out, having his nice life, doing all the stuff he was doing. And then God did tell him to marry me. And the way that happened for him was that he was helping me move house. And he just thought, oh, yeah, Natalie's nice. And this kind of thought emerged into his head that was like, yeah, I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life with her. And then he was like, I'm going to do what? And for him, it was quite a different sort of, it was this kind of like, oh, am I? I'm going to do this, am I? And he was definitely less negative about the idea of marrying me than I was about marrying him. And about 12 days later, we then had a conversation where it emerged that we'd both had this, it was a very odd conversation from different sofas in this room, in my living room, where we suddenly were like, yeah, so I think we're supposed to get married. And we got married 6 months later, and we've now been married 11 years. So Yeah, those are a couple of the early examples. But I could talk for a long time about things God has said to me. But yeah, those are two things in terms of the tangible, how it is actually experienced for me.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. That answers David's question here. So yeah, I'm actually happy with that, and that actually fits in um, with my methodology. So in terms of properly basic beliefs, or you could have a knowledge by acquaintance. It's this direct conviction, I think, is what you've said, or I call it an irresistible inclination to believe this is true, that God's telling you to marry this person or that sort of thing. One thing I'm sort of curious about before I turn it back over to David, so moving away from sort of the means or the mechanisms and how we can know that they're reliable, do you think that there are any conditions or limitations on the types of information God can reveal to people based on the way He's doing it, or is just anything up for grabs? Like, can He give me lottery numbers, or does He reveal doctrinal matters? Yeah. How do you see? If He does reveal lottery numbers, I would love it. But but yeah, how do you see the content as being relevant to how He reveals things?
Yeah, I suppose my experience, and I can't talk, for everybody, but my experience is that it's all relational. So, and what we need, what we think we need versus what we actually need are very different. And so, I think, my experience has been, God told me a decade ago that I was going to work to address male violence nationally in the UK, and I was had just got married, had two small kids, and didn't know anybody. And a decade later, that's exactly what I do. And so that was something that was a prediction, like we talked about before. God told me that we needed to move to another area that was much poorer than the area we lived, and all the Christians we knew, thought that we were mad. And then when all our house move fell through, and I was really distraught, and I was in the car driving, crying, going, God, why have you done this to us? And God just said to me, get over yourself, Natalie, the honeymoon's over. I was like, rude. And so in that instance, like and God said to me, you've had a child who nearly died, and you're crying because your house move fell through. Pull yourself together. And then in another instance, quite recently, I've been working really hard, and I have a God day every month. I go and have a day alone on my own, walking along the seafront by myself with God. And I was tired, and I'd been praying. God said to me, like, go be kind to yourself, go home and have a bath. And so, like, it's not as simple as going, is there limits to God, is God going to give us lottery numbers? My experience has been like that's so far away from the way that that for me, God has been about, like, my experience of God has been this being that's in relationship with me, and on occasions is going to be like, you are wrong, pull yourself together, get over yourself, whatever. And then on other occasions is going to be like, I just love you. Like, I suppose I see it in terms of the relationship I have with my kids, or or with a friend or whatever, that actually what God is saying to me, or what I need to know in that moment. And I think as much as we all might imagine that we need to know lottery numbers, I would say that's probably much more influenced by capitalism than
Yeah.
than what we actually need to know, I suppose.
So let me just interject here and say something that might be surprising to the audience. I don't actually doubt any of the things that you're saying about your experience.
Yeah.
I got out of the business a long time ago of determining whether someone was telling the truth about their experience. It's much easier to just accept their self-report of what they experience and move on, because I have no way of judging whether you are telling the truth about your experience or not. And furthermore, there's nothing inconsistent with nature and your experience. So the thing that I question with people is not whether they had the experience that they say they have, but whether they're interpreting it properly. And so it's you're telling me that God is speaking to you, and I would question, well, how do you know that? But I am not questioning whether you had an experience of being spoken to and directed in certain ways. But I think what a lot of people like myself would say is, well, you have become very good at self-talk. I think that psychologists used to call it self-talk. I think that you know what I mean, though. You were able to internalize things almost in the form of a conversation and move yourself in one direction or another. It's not miraculous, and it may feel like you're talking to someone else, but you're actually being very self-directed, and this is one of the reasons why you don't know lottery tickets, because you really don't know what the lottery tickets are. But in ways that are very very human and very intuitive, you can kind of talk yourself through things like that. Now, I don't know whether that's what's happening or not. That would be my guess. But I would ask, theologically speaking, let's just say that it is in the realm of the supernatural. How do you, just like I would ask about Abraham or any of the biblical characters, how do you know you're hearing from God? Because even theologically, there are other options that you could be hearing from. The devil is so good at this; he could maybe deceive the very elect. So how would you know?
I mean, I think I hear this. I hear what you're saying about self-talk. I think the reason, one of the things, particularly in the early days of me hearing God speak to me, is that God was often directing me to do stuff that I had no desire to do of my own accord, like so telling me to marry someone that I wasn't in any way attracted to, or did not
consciously. You weren't consciously
not
aware.
Yeah, I was not. I mean, we ended up in sex therapy within a few months of getting married, so it wasn't like I got married and I was like, oh yeah, it's all fine now. It's just not been, so it's not. I'm genuinely telling you, like, it wasn't conscious or unconscious at that time. It's all right, don't worry, we're doing fine now. But so I suppose another example of a situation where I would say that this is not just about self-talk. So about 4 years ago, a family member of mine, her child had been in care, so foster care, because of her neglect of him, and he was re-returned to her. And he was about to be re-returned into foster care, and we moved her halfway across the country to come and live with us because we felt God had told us that we needed to care for her. So we moved them to live with us, and for 6 months we cared for her and him, and it emerged over that time that she couldn't care for him. So she then left and asked us to adopt him. And so I went on this journey of, like, I said to God, I can't take him on as my own because that gives her too much power. Because if I take him, I'm happy to foster him, but if I take him on as my own child and she wants him back, I don't know how we'll cope with that. And God said to me, no, you have to take him on. You have to take him on as your own. I didn't have any desire to do that. And I took him on. We took him on as our own. And we believed that meant that he was going to stay with us, because I didn't believe that this God would would have asked me to take him on as my own if he wasn't going to ensure that we were protected from that damage. And last year she changed her mind, and she said she wanted him back, and we fought it through the court, and he was re-returned to her after he'd been with us for 3 years. He called his mum and dad, and we lost him, and he moved halfway back up the country to live with his mum, and we have very little contact with him now. And so, like, genuinely, there is nothing within any sort of part of me that wanted to be in that situation, that wanted to, we sacrificed lots of our life, lots of our children's lives. We've got 2 children, 15 and 13 now, to be able to take on this child that, we would have looked after, but not as our own. And but that wasn't what God called us to do. And it's not easy. And I've been on a journey of working out why God asked us to do that. And my conclusion so far is that little boy needed to belong to somebody for the time that he was with us. And nothing can account for why that he's ended up back in a situation because the system's broken, and it's not the greatest of situations for him. But I think this idea that I'm good at self-talk, it literally is not. It would mean working against my own best interests.
Well, but even putting that aside, it still doesn't answer the question of how do you know you're talking to a specific supernatural being when there
Yeah.
are other
So that
options.
Yeah, so in terms of so that would just kind of address the self-talk thing. So
Hmm.
that bit. In terms of how do I know that I'm speaking to God? Um, well, it comes down to a matter of faith that it's a consistent my experience of God is consistent, in that it involves great amounts of love, affirmation, but also challenging me to do things that are not very comfortable and that I wouldn't necessarily do I wouldn't do out of my own kind of compelled to do out of my own just desires. I suppose the commonalities in these experiences of God speaking to me and there are other ways that God has spoken to me, but on these kind of ones where it's quite dramatic and God asking me to do very specific, quite large things, the commonalities is there's this kind of sense that there is a sense this is God, this isn't something else. This is God, and this God is the Christian God that I've kind of chosen to be in relationship with. The second thing in that there is a level of compelling, or I think Doug said something about like irresistible something, but there is this kind of compellingness to it that feels like my life, I could choose not to do this, but my life is going to be deeper, wider, larger, more I can't even, it's just going to be bigger if I take this path, even though it doesn't make any sense. It's quite illogical. I think a lot of the time it has not been things that I've wanted in my own desires as a human being. It's been marrying somebody I wouldn't have ever chosen to. It's been taking on a child who subsequently got taken away from us. It's doing things that don't necessarily, it's moving to an area that nobody wants to live in. These things are not things that naturally most humans with their with their like natural like survival instincts would make decisions to do. And I think with testing, it becomes stronger, that actually delaying it, or, just thinking, well, I'll try it out. If I try out seeing the world this way or making this sort of decision and I don't do anything sort of dramatic straight away, what happens? Does it get weaker or stronger? And so there's something about this compelling grows. It doesn't just kind of shrink and we go, oh well, that was just out of my own head. And I think the last thing is the fruit of it, what emerges out as a result of it. And the marriage that I have with my husband has been amazing, and the things that we've been able to do, and he's absolutely the best possible person I could have married. He's absolutely brilliant, and he's full time at home with the kids and does all of my admin so that I can do the work that I do. He is brilliant and we're a great team. The little boy that we took on, although he's not with us anymore, the way that he is succeeding in school is absolutely amazing, and he couldn't have done that without us. So the fruit of these things is that there is transformation, and there is the world is made better as a result of these decisions. And so I think it's those five things together. And absolutely, you could say, well, is it like an alien life form telling me to do these things, or is it like some other god or whatever? But actually, like, I have chosen to dedicate my life to the Christian God, and so my experience has been that the more that I choose to dedicate myself to the Christian God, and the more that I read the Bible, and the more that I take time out with this God, this Christian God, the more that my life, the types of things that I'm being directed to do are these sorts of things, and they correspond with my commitment to the Christian God.
Okay.
Yeah. One question, from a Christian standpoint, for perhaps we do have a lot of Christian listeners as well. Now, one thing they might be saying though is, they've never experienced God speaking to them in such a direct way themselves. Like for better or worse, I have to admit I've never experienced God giving me specific instructions through an internal audible voice. So I'm just out of curiosity, do you think there's something wrong with the Christian? Like, should I be engaging in spiritual disciplines, and maybe in time I will have this? Or is God saying, well, I know how to communicate with you versus another Christian and that sort of thing? So yeah, is there something that the Christian should be doing in order to take on more, in order to have the type of way that God communicated to you? Or is it more, no, God knows the best way to communicate with each individual Christian, and so he's doing it in certain ways to meet them as individuals? How would you answer that?
Well, I think firstly, I'd say I don't think I'm like extremely special.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm more special than people who God doesn't speak to like that. So I don't think it's about me having something, like having a special thing that other people don't have. That my understanding is that as a result of Jesus, we all have the same access to God and the Holy Spirit. I think the things that I recognize within my experiences that definitely are part of why I experience God in this way is that I experienced significant levels of suffering. I think I was once asked what is the most influential, I think it was something like, what is the most been the most influential thing in your faith? Like, is it art or music? And I was like, pain. being going through really horrific things are in my own kind of understanding of it, the reason why that opened up a space in which God started to speak to me, and in which I chose to do whatever God wanted. I was living in a hospital with a premature baby and a 2.5-year-old, divorcing my husband, going through a court case because he had assaulted me, causing my child's premature birth. And when you lose everything, when absolutely everything is stripped away, and all that's left at the end of everything else is this God, that there's something that changed in me, that I said I will always do what God says, and I will always trust God, and I will do that, and nothing else will get in the way. And obviously at times things do get in the way, but I've tried as much as I can to not be willing for anything to be of a higher priority than God. And I think that came from losing everything. And I think, and so I don't think it's necessarily a pathway I can advocate for. As in, like, so Christians, you want to hear from God more? Go through terrible things. But I think that in Western culture, we are so conditioned to be averse to suffering, that actually we our kind of self-protective instincts kick in so much that we don't ever get a chance to experience God in those places where everything else is lost. And and I think this is not like just me saying this. That liberation theology recognizes this, that if you look at how people experience God in parts of the world where there is very little, where people have a lot less, that their experience of God is a lot more visceral, and a lot more understanding of God telling people to do stuff, that almost our complacency and our consumerism and capitalism, I'm not a massive fan of capitalism, you may have guessed, those things get in the way of us being able to hear from God. So I think that's the first thing. I think in terms of the ongoing practices that have been helpful for me, that I think we often...
Just a moment. Before you get to your ongoing practices, I can't contain myself anymore. I don't understand.
Awaken the beast now.
Yeah, so I'm not going to say the conversation's about to get interesting now, because it's been interesting before and we're actually near the end of it. But I don't understand why you wouldn't say the pathway to closer communication with God is through suffering. I mean, I understand that you think maybe that sounds crazy and you want to step back from that ledge a little bit. But everything that you were telling me suggests that the path to a closer relationship with God is through hardship. Now, that sounds to me, from an outsider, and I have to reiterate here for people who are not familiar with the show and familiar with me, I was an insider for most of my life. I was a Christian for most of my life and a preacher for a significant part of that. So I'm not unfamiliar with how Christians talk and think. But it seems to me terribly suspicious that God can only communicate with people successfully when they're in a really bad state, when they're at rock bottom, their lowest state of human existence. God has a hard time communicating with people when they're doing well. In our weakness, he is strong, the passage says. And I'm just wondering why this God thrives so well on our weakness, when we might have all kinds of psychological distress and things, and then say, okay, well, maybe this is God talking to me. Why couldn't he have done that when we were stronger and our mental state was not in question, and such? Yeah. Just as a quick follow up, not Dale. Well, actually Dale too. But I was thinking about Justin and many people like that. Their stories of conversion began when they're teens or younger. And I also find that suspicious, that God finds a way to communicate with people when their brains are not fully formed. It has a harder time communicating with people when their brains are fully formed. This just seems like a very suspicious thing to me that I find troubling. But if it is the truth, if it is the way this God communicates, then why not say what you need to do is suffer more?
Because it's not about so that there are lots of historical accounts of people trying to fabricate suffering in order to experience God. It's like you can't make it happen. I think that there's a real risk of what I'm saying, that people take it in a kind of sadomasochistic type, like if I cause myself loads of pain, like self-flagellation. People did used to self-harm to try and get close to God. People starved themselves to try and get close to God. And I'm not saying that God can't speak to it. Most of my life that God has spoken to me when I'm not suffering, and that actually my experience of God is that through that time when things were difficult, God spoke to me, but actually the way that God has also healed me and transformed me, and I had all sorts of traumatic issues that I've been healed from through counseling, through therapies, but also because of prayer and because of my growing understanding of God's love for me, and my security being in God, not in something else. So it's not just that God can only get in touch with us when we're broken, and that he only likes broken people. Actually, that our ability to hear from God when we're in a broken state, our ability is greater. Not that God is closer to us in those times, but that when these other things are stripped away, when success and career and all those things are stripped away, that's when we're more able to hear from God. Not that God's not trying to speak to us other times, but I think it's much harder for us to hear when all the other things in life, all the cares and worries of the life, as it says in the Bible, those things threaten to choke out God. And so it's only when we're put in positions where those things can no longer be the priority, when having the best job or having the most stuff, when all of that things are stripped away, that there's enough space for God to get in. That's not to say that God can't speak to us other times, or that God wants us broken, because my experience has been that I wouldn't be alive and I wouldn't be transformed without God. So God didn't want to keep me broken, but that brokenness meant that he could get in. Other things were no longer taking up my time and capacity.
I will unsatisfactorily let that stand, because I can feel my co-host thinking, okay, you've had a rebuttal, shut up. This is what he is saying.
No, I think it was good to actually tease that out, believe it or not, because I think what Natalie is saying does make sense. It does resonate in the sense, in my context, right? People need to be a real seeker for God, and that entails being open-minded for God to reveal the truth to them.
But why should being wealthy and healthy and wise and happy keep you from being open-minded? That seems to be like the perfect state to find God. That's where, I mean,
No, no,
honestly,
like,
if
if
no, let me hear me out, because I've preached these sermons and I've got some penance to do here. This is absurd. You should not, in fact, hear God better when you're in a broken state. There is nothing in life that we do better when we're in a broken state besides cry. We don't think better. We don't reason better. We don't have better relationships. We're not better when we're broken. And so the idea that, even though God doesn't want you to be broken, you can certainly hear him a lot better when you can. No, you can't. And if you can, there's something broken about the way God talks to us.
Yeah, but I think when you get, I mean, I could be broken because they run out of peanut butter at the store or something. Maybe to me that is so devastating or whatever. But people in general, it's not a necessary criterion or prerequisite for God to communicate to you. I mean, Bill Gates could be happy as heck and God could communicate to him if he is a real seeker. But just as a generalization, people in general tend to become more open to considering these, spiritual possibilities.
They become more desperate. What you're describing as open is not a healthy kind of open.
I don't
Go ahead,
think it's about I don't think it's about so I'm trying to think about this, right? This idea of brokenness, it's making, we're all like, it's not true that we don't do better in brokenness. I don't think that's necessarily true. Like that actually the wealthiest people are not the best people. The people who have the most in life are not the kindest or most generous. That actually, the more we have, the more that we are entitled. So I don't think it's true to say that the better off we are and the more we have, and that makes us that makes us in the best place. I just don't think that's true. So I would say that the idea that having everything and not needing for anything makes you in a better place to make good decisions, I don't think that's true. I think obviously if you're in a level of desperation, which means you can't function, that's also problematic. But the idea that being broken means broken people make worse decisions than people who've got everything together, I don't think that's true.
Well, I don't know that that's what I was saying, but in general, we're physical animals. And I know that, just talking about my job, which is a very mundane thing, I do not do better by being deprived of sleep. That is a form of brokenness that I would like to avoid as much as possible. I'm not better when I'm sleep deprived and hungry, and irritable and desperate. This does not make us better, and it doesn't help us make better decisions. And so if there was a pattern in my life where I said, well, all of my decisions, my important decisions, came much easier when I was starving, say, that would be reason to question the important decisions of my life, and I wouldn't expect people to listen to me if that's where it came from. But I hear Christians talk this way all the time, as if it's a virtue that somehow makes it better. I mean, the Bible talks about it this way. James suggests that it is that God chose the poor in the world to be rich in faith. What does that mean? God chose the poor in the world to be rich in faith? You can't be rich in the faith and be rich? How about just not being poor? But why? What is it about poverty that makes you rich in faith, or why does God choose that as the better conduit? I really don't understand that. It really does feel like an unhealthy obsession to me with just reveling in your weakness so that God can look so much stronger, like the rescuer. And I think my relationship with my parents is much better as an adult than it was when I was a child, because I can interact with them as equals now. I understand how the world works. I don't have to ask their permission to have a cookie. We have a very different kind of relationship, and it is not a relationship of me being broken and them being strong with all the answers. And I don't think that's a healthy way of thinking about the Christian relationship either.
So I would say, firstly, you said something about like all my important decisions will be better if I'm hungry or starving or sleep deprived. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I guess the question was, why do I hear like God directly speaking to me? And the thing that I've identified through my own journey, which has enabled me to start to hear God in that way, was meeting God in a level of brokenness. But that's not how I hear from God now. It's not like, oh well, I have to remain broken or God won't speak to me, or I have to be not have enough food, or I have to be suffering in order for God to speak to me. That actually that point, that moment in which God came in, led to all sorts of healing. And you know, I now own a home and a car, and and have, you know, I'm financially stable and have a job that I love and a life that's amazing, and my kids are healthy, and I don't have anything that I could say I am suffering with at this moment. So it's not the case that there is this sense that God keeps us broken and keeps us damaged and keeps us with no power in order to feel powerful, and that's how this God works. There's something about how suffering can open up a sense, a shifting of priorities from me and me wanting to have everything and wanting to be wealthy. Like, I have a lot more than I ever expected I would ever have in my life, and that's because God has been part of the healing and the transformation and the provision. And I think, you know, that if we were to look at those who are the most wealthy in the world and those who are the poorest in the world, we would definitely see that the decisions that those who are the most wealthy in the world are not to make the world a better place for everybody. That wealth is absolutely disproportionately perpetuated and in ways that are oppressive to the most poor in the world. And, you know, and that's something about how wealth and power makes humans be toxic. And so I think that there's something in that whole thing that the Bible's saying about the poor will be blessed, or the poor will know the truth, because actually they won't be the ones oppressing other people and dehumanizing other people. Not, I mean, you know, I don't want to kind of glorify poverty or whatever, but actually I think the idea that wealth and goodness go together is not proven if you look throughout societies in the world.
So I am much happier with your answer and happier to leave it. Now, I'm not happy, but I'm happier.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, I think, and I don't know if we have any point of agreement here or not. Whereas I can see that when a person hits rock bottom, they start looking at options that they would not look at before. Yeah. But with something as important as eternal destiny and the you know, the reality of the universe, so there's a God here in this other realm of spirituality, I would think that this would be something that God would be very careful and sure of to present to us when we are living our best humanity, whatever it is. It doesn't matter whether it's when you're the wealthiest or not. But whatever the state is where your brain is fully developed, you're emotionally mature, you're financially stable, and then you can evaluate these things calmly and reasonably, as opposed to, you know, somehow almost taking advantage of us when we are at our most vulnerable state. That just feels predatory to me.
I think one of the things I would say is that I am in agreement with you that I think it's very problematic the way that Christians evangelize to people in very, very distraught places. So I think that Christians have to be very careful about going into prisons, about people with mental health issues, and have to be very careful not to be taking, I think it's very different that God can speak into people's lives when they're at their lowest, and that Christians take advantage of conversion opportunities when people are at their lowest. Because I think actually if somebody, I suppose I'd grown up with a Christian faith and had this kind of understanding, and it happened, there were no people involved in terms of, it wasn't like I was part of a church or had people who were kind of directing me towards this. It was very much, it came from God. So I think we have to be really careful that Christians don't use this this theology or the sort of things that I'm saying to think, oh great, well let's get to people when they're their lowest. I think it's very problematic to encourage people to be baptized or commit to big dramatic faith journeys when they're in a really, really damaged place. So I'm always very concerned when somebody kind of makes public statements of conversion when they're in their most traumatized state. I don't think that's healthy. I think we wouldn't be encouraging somebody to get married when they're at their lowest, and I don't think we should be encouraging people to make statements of faith until they're in a better place. So it's not like when I was in the middle of all this I would be talking about it in the way I am now. It was very much a journey that I was going on, and it's only looking back that I could tell you that this was all going on in that space, whereas but actually nobody was asking me to stand up on a platform and tell people my journey when I was in the middle of all this awfulness. And so I think it's very different that God can come in and speak to us and offer us new ways of being in those dark places. I think it's very different when that's something that's being kind of driven by manipulation or by people's kind of agendas to convert, which I think is really problematic.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree myself 100%.
And we also have found a point of agreement, so that I am happy to I am now happy to be able to move on, just by way of keeping my promise. We're a little past the hour mark, about an hour and 13 minutes. How do you feel, Natalie?
I'm good. I'm happy to continue chatting.
Okay.
Awesome.
So we got a couple of more things here. Not long, not a lot, because we've actually covered a lot of the stuff that we had on the list. But Dale, what do you see here that we haven't covered thoroughly?
So here's one that I don't think we totally covered. It wasn't actually one of your questions, but I just wanted to quickly throw it to Natalie to get. I hear these different methods and stuff that God is using to communicate and that sort of thing, but there are some Christians who hold to us, cessationalism, and they'll say, look, the time for that is past. We no longer have prophets. We no longer have miracle healers or God contacting us in such direct ways, and they'll say the Bible supports this view of cessationalism. I don't know how familiar you are with that debate, but did you have anything to say against that? Like why that would not be the case, or what are your thoughts for Christians who hold to that position?
Well, I would say they're wrong. Like fundamentally, I'd say, like I can appreciate that for some people they come to that conclusion because there is a lot of harm that can be done by the sort of charismatic end of the spectrum. I think that in some ways it's much safer to believe that God doesn't speak to people, because actually then you don't have to verify who's accurate and who's not. I can totally appreciate and sympathize with people who come to that conclusion, but actually if we believe that, what is the point? Are we literally just got to wait until we die, and then what is the point of this life now, if it isn't that God has a direct relationship with us that is mutual, and there's something going on both ways? It sort of prioritizes this kind of eternal idea that everything happens kind of when we die, and I find that really problematic, and I think it leads to some really problematic stuff. There's a quote that I recently used in a preach about justice that from Napoleon, so I can't remember the exact quote, but it says, what is it that keeps the poor man in his house with no fire while I have 10 fires burning, and with no food when I have enough food for 10 families, and why I have like loads of clothes and he doesn't even have one coat? It's religion that says that one day my life will be terrible and his life will be brilliant, essentially. And so I think that there is a real risk that I know cessationism isn't primarily about that, but it feeds into this idea that it's all about when we die. And Christian Aid, who's a big NGO in the UK, they say, we believe in life before death. And so, I believe that this God is not only about speaking to us, when we die, that God has not changed, and that so that this God is able to speak to us in the now. And I think that apart from anything else, I feel really sad for them that they're settling for a form of faith and of relationship with God that denies God the power to be part of their lives in really transformative ways, I guess.
Perfect. Yeah,
So,
I'll turn it over to David if he has that covers all
oh,
the.
you bet I do.
Okay. But,
You,
yeah,
have
in
we
your head,
met?
we've covered the list. So yeah, if you've got follow up, you go
I
right
do.
ahead,
So there
Mr.
was
David.
one other thing on the list that we actually haven't covered. By the way, Natalie, you didn't get the list.
I
Sorry,
didn't.
sorry, not sorry. I
That's
didn't.
fine. I'm happy to not have the list.
Yes, I didn't want you to over prepare. I can assure you that Dale and I did not over prepare. but just to
Doing an
not.
excellent job, though, I would say for
Yes,
off
no.
the
This
cuff.
is this is where I find our guests really shine is when they're really not entirely sure what's coming. So you're doing great. But there's so. Let me get mildly controversial. You know how you define profit, and you know how I define profit, and I don't think we're too far apart with profit. Do you consider yourself a prophet by any definition?
Yes, I would say, in terms of what God has specifically called me to, which is to challenge the church to reject patriarchy and misogyny, and to move forward to more liberatory ways of understanding the relationship between men and women, and how we understand God. I would say that, yeah, that definitely functions in a prophetic way, in a kind of Old Testament type, the prophets who tell the people of God where they're going wrong. So I think to some degree, yes, I would say that I see God calling me to that sort of role.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of inside baseball. A look at how the sausage is made. I was actually more prepared for you to say no, and then I was going to talk you into admitting that you are a prophet, and then I was going to try to show you where that's wrong. But now you have said you are a prophet. And I've got a reverse course now.
I've ruined your whole plan. Do you want me to go back and just pretend I wasn't saying
Yes, I do, because I've got a spiel for that, and my spiel isn't quite as developed for this, but it is not completely without follow up, though. And I just want you to understand, I'm speaking less as a host now and more as a guy who has followed this sort of thing very closely, lived my life within religion, and I'm just a normal person talking to a normal prophet for the next few minutes here. Okay,
Prophet
that.
test, I believe is.
Nobody ever calls me normal. That's
So once again, you could have said no one ever calls me a prophet. You went the other way. That's so. So I guess a follow-up would be, Natalie, I mean, you have to understand, this sounds very, very strange to me. This sounds like not the way the world works. Even when I was a Christian, this sounds like not the way the world works. But if just giving your testimony, its most powerful credibility. If you are a prophet in any sense of the word, do you believe that your words are veridical, in that people need to listen to what you say as if it was being spoken by God? Because if in fact God is telling you things that have doctrinal and theological import, it would seem to make sense that you are the one to listen to. How do you feel about that? Are you infallible because you're speaking from God? Or what does that even mean from a practical perspective from someone listening to you, especially from someone who disagrees with you?
Yeah. So I'd like to just go, yes, everyone should listen to me.
Again, not the direction I expected you to go. So.
Just say, "Thus saith the Lord," and it's good. There. That's the.
I don't think it is. It would. I definitely don't agree that everything that I say is like a prophetic word from God, and I think I would want to be careful about saying there is kind of a universal truth of it. I think we're all contextual beings, and we're all meant for community. And so I think that what I'm saying, maybe the context I'm called to is the UK church, perhaps the Western church to some degree. And so what I'm saying has to be taken within that context and has to be contextualized. So I think, to kind of, is it universally true for all people at all times? Well, no. I think that it's true for the context I'm speaking to and the place God's called me to. Usually what I say to people when I'm doing training or speaking or preaching or anything is that if what I'm saying makes you uncomfortable, I could absolutely be wrong, but could you spend some time working out whether that your discomfort is because I'm wrong or because it's challenging stuff within you? And at the end of that, if you still decide I'm wrong, then that's up to you. Like, I don't see my job as to convince anybody that I'm right, because that requires other people to change their minds. And it's not my job to do that. I see my job as planting seeds and then just trusting that those seeds will grow in the hearts and lives of the people that it is right for that to happen. And so I wouldn't want to kind of say that, like, if I'm preaching, that everything I say is right. Like, for instance, I was preaching and I just made a throwaway comment that I'm better at growing children than plants, and I meant it in that I always kill plants and that children I manage to kind of feed and clothe and they don't shrivel up and die on a windowsill. But the way it sounded was that my uterus is much better because it grows things in it. And somebody spoke to me afterwards to say that actually it could have been really hurtful to people that I'd said that, particularly for women who've not being able to conceive. And so I absolutely wouldn't want everyone to be yes, that was a word from the Lord about judgment on barren women, or because that's horrific. And I felt terribly horrified that anybody could have taken something negative from it. And so I think I wouldn't want to say that I am in any way less fallible than anybody else at all, but I really take the responsibility that God has called me to say some stuff that are currently not being said or that haven't been said in the way that I'm saying them, and to say those things and to trust that those seeds get planted and they grow in the people that it's right for them to grow in, and that for the people who aren't ready to hear what I'm saying, or who for them it's not true or it's hurtful. So most of what I talk about is male violence towards women, and there may be men who've been abused by a female partner, and so for them what I'm saying might feel really problematic, and so for them it may not be that it's important for them to hear that. There may be somebody else they should be listening to who's saying things that are important for them. So yeah, I'm not invested in everybody agreeing with me, and I don't think that everything I say is right, but I believe God's called me to say it, and so I will say it, and whoever will listen will.
That doesn't make sense to me. I am sorry. If you are talking from God, then what you're saying is right, and people don't have a choice to listen to you or not listen to you. I'm thinking about your appearance on Unbelievable, where you spoke with, remind me of his name, I've forgotten.
Yes. Do you know?
Yeah, I'm not trying to put you on trial here.
Phil Moore.
That's it, Phil.
Yes.
So when you spoke to Phil has a very particular view on compatibilism, which is fairly mainstream in the church, and then you have a view on egalitarianism, not as popular. I wouldn't say that it's not mainstream, but it's not the dominant view. But the fact of the matter is, you told me on Still Unbelievable that part of the reason you interpret the Bible the way you do is because you have, in a sense, heard from God on how this should be understood. And so I didn't challenge that then, and I'm not going to challenge it now. I will simply say that if it is the case that Natalie Collins has a greater understanding of this because God explained it to her, then there is not a choice in the church to listen or not to listen. The only choice is whether they believe you when they when you say you're hearing from God or not. That's the only choice. And if people believe that, then they need to put down whatever understanding they have of compatibilism versus egalitarianism and just go with what you've said because you have spoken prophetically. How is that not right?
Yeah, I would, but I would say that I'm being obedient to what God has said to me to do and to say. I am not responsible for. I can't be like everybody should just believe me. The end. I don't think that's healthy anyway. I think everybody should be able to question me, and I think that the fruit of what I'm saying is whether more people do come on board with this view, and and that actually it does lead to people choosing to treat women differently, and it does lead to liberation for people. I think that's part of how we know it's true or not, whether people get on board with it. That's like part of it. I'm not like some sort of cult leader that's like, if you don't agree with me, then you clearly are.
But you should be. God's talking to you. You should be Moses.
Because I'm not God. Like God, I feel like I'm.
Okay, but Moses wasn't God either, and you wouldn't say that Moses was a cult leader. I think I probably would. But if God's having conversations with Moses in a tent, and then Moses comes out and says, "Well, this God says, so this is what we're going to do," that should be you too. If that's the conversation you're having.
I think it's about my approach to this is not like everybody has to believe me, but that if God's saying this, then they should at least be willing to consider it. But that I can't make anybody change their mind. Only God can do that, and that I'm not invested in everybody agreeing with me, because that would make me more interested in me being right than doing what God tells me. It's not about, I'm doing it because this is what God has told me is the way things are, and this is what God has called me to do. God has opened up doors and given me opportunities to say the stuff that I'm saying. And absolutely, it'd be great for Phil Moore to turn up one day and be like, Natalie was right all along. Yeah. Absolutely. I would love to see that, mostly not because I want to be right, but mostly because the women in his church and the women in his life will benefit from a situation where there is more open, where there is an approach that women and men are both equally called to all of the same sorts of stuff. So for me, it's not about, I hear what you're saying, but I think fundamentally my goal is not to get everybody to listen to me and agree with me. My goal is to do what God says and to leave the rest of it up to God. And I'm not, I don't really know what, part of the problem with using Moses as an example was that other people didn't have access to the Holy Spirit apart from Moses and the few, the 12 people he laid hands on at various points. And, that the Spirit of God only worked in very specific chosen people's lives. Whereas we're now in a situation where where everybody can have access to that. So I don't think that it's not the same scenario as it was then.
So last follow up, I know that Dale, he's choking me with this leash. He's trying to reel me back.
I hope that I'm not seeing anything.
Yank on that leash again, and I will bite your arm off. Look, this I did indicate that it was about to get interesting. So, the last follow up here, I will govern myself here. Let me calm down. All right. So, if that is the case, why doesn't God just talk to Phil? It's obvious that Phil's a man of faith. It's obvious that Phil has a heart to do what's right. He is trying to follow God the best he can. Why should God tell you these things and leave Phil, left to figure it out for himself, or believe you or not believe? Why not just tell you and Phil and maybe anyone else who wants to know? Why is he talking to you this directly and answering these hard questions? And not everybody.
Well, I mean, I wish I had the answer, because that would make everything a lot easier. I think partly my being in possession of a vagina and Phil not probably has some part to play in why we understand things the way we do. That God interacts with us in relationship based on where we're coming from. And so my understanding of this stuff, and the reason I have the views that I do, and the reason I approach this the way I do, is partly because of all the stuff that I've experienced and been subjected to, which has given me a particular understanding of this that other people, thank goodness, have not had to approach. But, like, for instance, a few years ago, I had this online interaction with somebody because I was moaning about a seminar about feminism and Jesus that had more men speaking at it than women, and I had a bit of like, this is ridiculous, and somebody like challenged me and said that I was wrong, and then years later he saw me at something and said to me, like, I'm really sorry, like, I was wrong and you were right in that situation. And like, and I was like, I didn't know that he'd gone away and then gone on a journey to realizing, a few years later, that this stuff that he'd thought wasn't the way things were. And so who knows the journey that Phil will be on. So I suppose I see myself as being one part in people's journeys, but it's not a case of that, like, God doesn't just kind of, like, plug into our brain and download the right information. God is in relationship with us, and so how we understand the world and how God interacts with us is based on everything that we bring, because God loves us as whole beings, not just as like people who hold information. And so I suppose for me it's about I'm not invested in trying to convince people. I'm not invested in trying to get it all, get them to agree with me, because that would make it about me, which it's not. It's about just being obedient, that God has told me these things and God has directed me to share those things, and hopefully people will get on board. But I can't know the journey that's people are going to go on from when they've spoken to me. And if I only decided, well, it's true because everybody turned around and like zombies shook their head and went, oh, Natalie, you are right, like that's not I want for people to go on the journey for themselves and realize this is true for themselves, because then they will take it on rather than just suddenly going, oh, okay, it's all right. And I mean, there's a really.
But don't you think it's unfair, though, of you to not just tell people up front that you heard it from God? I mean, so I teased it out of you a little bit because this is what I do. I talk to people about things that are really interesting to me. But when you were on the Phil Moore show, at no point, the Phil Moore show. Wow. Yeah, no, I do not recommend that show. When you were on Unbelievable with Phil Moore, it seems like you could have cut through a lot of this by just saying, "Hey, Phil, this is not Natalie. This is thus saith the Lord," and that would have been that.
But I think the thing is that not only are me and Phil having a conversation and on a journey together, everybody who watches that is going on a journey too. And that thus saith the Lord is not a way to help anybody on that journey. Really,
I don't want a journey. I want the right answer. What is going on? I don't want the journey to nowhere, the journey through the pit of sorrows, the journey through. No, I don't. Skip the journey. I don't want to oppress women because I'm ignorant of what the Bible means. Just tell me. I obviously care about what God says. When I was a Christian, I care about what God says. Obviously, I wanted to know. You obviously knew I was on the wrong path, and you're talking to me as Natalie, and I'm thinking, well, who's Natalie? I don't need to. If you had tell me. You've got more authority than that. Don't let me go on this weird journey. You know how many women I've accidentally oppressed because I was on a journey and no one said, thus saith the Lord, this is the actual answer. That could have saved a lot of lives.
But I don't think that's the reality is that he doesn't even believe that as a woman I can hold authority. In reality, it doesn't matter that, like, to somebody who doesn't believe this is true, me saying God has told me it's true is not going to make it true to them, because they'll just say, well, Natalie's wrong.
Yeah, well, it may not have helped him, but it would have helped the audience, because you're talking to a million people at that time.
Because I think anybody who already agreed with me would have understood that God had given me that information. And anybody who didn't agree with me would just think that I was wrong. And so I don't think anybody is massively helped by thus saith the Lord. Like, there's a quote that I use a lot that I don't know where it came from, but it says a healthy relationship is not based on agreement, it's based on understanding, and that the agreement requires somebody to change their mind, and that's not always possible, but we can always seek for greater understanding of one another. And I suppose I see if I can help people to understand more about this stuff, if I can help them to understand more about this God who loves women, and who challenges patriarchy, then hopefully that will help them on the journey. I know, I'm sorry, I know you don't want there to be a journey.
Oh, I don't want a journey.
But that's what it all is. Nothing really is anything, like anything worth having is not going to come easy.
Fair enough.
Dale,
Perfect.
save me from myself, Dale.
Yeah, I do think I appreciated the back and forth. I think these are fair questions, and our audience wants to know and that sort of thing. I am on Natalie's side. I don't think, I've tried the "Thus saith Dale," and that doesn't really work out too well. So.
But Dale, you have never said that you were speaking on behalf of God. So that's, in all fairness, had you said that, you would have a few more followers.
See, I was trying to have a witty joke, and you got to ruin it. But
this is what I do. I am the joke ruiner. It's my superpower.
But yeah. Just to close off, I've been really happy with this conversation. I think it'll be helpful for people on their journeys and considering Natalie's experience and stuff. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I hope you had a good time yourself, Natalie.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think I just wanted to bring in a couple of examples which haven't been like God directly speaking to me, just to give a few examples for people. Is that okay? Just that I think like the example that I've given so far are this kind of like God speaking to me very directly on very dramatic things, but I think God speaks to me day in, day out on things that are much more mundane. And so I just thought it might be helpful to give a bit of an example, particularly for people who are either not Christian or for people who are cessationists, to kind of go, actually, it's not always God telling you who to marry.
yeah, please. Yeah, I think that's important.
Also, just so you know, it's on our notes, but we mutually decided to skip it. So thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose like the most recent one I was going to give an example of, it's actually after the last time we did a podcast with the news in the US about the Southern Baptist Convention, the abuse there, and the previous week about the priests raping nuns as well. And I just I had a total meltdown. I just had this kind of tsunami of just I don't know how to be a Christian when Christians do this stuff. And this guy who's a big Christian in the UK had tweeted something about how he was going to the some sort of glorious international feast at church, and I was like, I tweeted this thing going, oh, and there's rapists in the feast, and are you happy to be in the feast with the rapists? And somebody just direct messaged me to be like, can you delete that? It's not helpful. And I was like, yeah, I probably should. But it just felt really I don't know how to be a Christian when there are so many horrifically awful people using Christianity to abuse, and really and in that moment was just I don't know what to do with this. And so in that space, the way that God spoke to me was I had this sort of, it was on a Sunday, and I had this kind of gentle sense of going to church, and my husband had already gone earlier, and so we only had one car that day, and so I ended up booking my first ever Uber because I suddenly was oh, I should definitely go to church, but I can't get there. So went to church, and the sermon was about 1 Corinthians 15, and basically the main thing that the preacher was saying was about that in that passage Paul says that the gospel is that the facts of Jesus living and dying and rising again, and that are essentially, he didn't go the core of the gospel is that Jesus loves you. He was no, that these facts that we understand of Jesus. And so for me, although that preach could have spoken to lots of people, it spoke to me in that it was saying that actually this feeling I was having, this I cannot be in this faith anymore, was that the reason I'm in this faith is because of my experience of Jesus and because of who Jesus was, and it is not because of all the shitty stuff that Christians do. And then I sort of just went on this bit of this kind of processing of it, in which I kind of came to this kind of conclusion that actually there's abusers everywhere. You look at the American gymnastics abuse of gymnasts, you look at Jimmy Savile, you look at Harvey Weinstein, all Michael Jackson, and so we don't when we see those cases, we don't go, well, let's stop doing gymnastics, let's stop having celebrity culture, let's stop having music and films, because we recognize that the abusers are using those things to get access, but that the institution itself doesn't have to be evil. And so that it was more a sort of processing thing that I came out the other side thinking, no, I've gone on a journey to come out to this point of going, actually, like, that's so in that sense it wasn't this kind of light bulb moment of God going, no, this is the way things are, you have to stay, and the Bible says, or anything like that. It was more this kind of the sermon in that context was really important. Another time I really felt God told me to start running, and because running is actually really good for you if you can do it. And I'd done running previously and wrecked my knee, and so I'd given up. But then I heard a guy preaching, and he talked about how God had healed his knee, and I was like, oh, I should probably like pray for my knee, like not really convinced God would do anything. But so I started to pray that my knee would be okay. And then I connected with a guy who wanted to start getting healthier. So I was like, oh, well, should we go running together? And then I discovered the Couch to 5K running app. And so I downloaded that. And then as I was sort of doing research on trauma, I discovered how important running is in terms of helping people recover from trauma. And so in that sense, I'm saying, oh, I really feel God told me to start running, but it wasn't like this audible voice in my head going, you must start running, but actually just various things. And, my knee has got better. And part of that was because I started running very gradually and very gently. And so it's not that everything that God says to me is this kind of booming voice telling me what to do, that circumstances and sermons and those kind of thing. And I go on a God day every month, and I go on a weekend away with God once a year, and I don't do like retreat centers or anything. I go and book into a cheap hotel and just spend 3 days working out what God wants to do. And so for me, in those times with God, there is times where I feel God very directly saying stuff to me, but actually a lot of it is me reading through the journals that I've written over the last year or the last month, being kind of really silent before God, both on a daily basis and then on when I go away, making time just to like really silence all of those stuff that's going on. I use something called the Ignatius Examen, which is a monastic tradition to silence myself, doing worship, making time on my own with God, and seeing what emerges in my head and my heart. And it may be about what's going on internally, but also what's going on around me. So it might be that a song comes on the radio in a cafe that I'm in, and I'm like, oh, like that's a really useful, that speaks to this thing that's going on for me. Or I'll be cycling up a hill praying, and suddenly God says to me something about this being an uphill struggle or whatever. Or the rain might start, and it might be just at a point when I'm going through something. I'm not saying that God makes it rain at that point, but it's almost that I become as much attuned to the fact that God could use anything to guide me, friendships and things people have said to me, or the challenges with my kids or whatever. So I guess that my experience has been, the more that I'm open and to the idea that God can speak to me, the more that these things I start to realize, oh, there's some truth that I can take from that. And I think that would very much more fit into the potential that you could perceive that as self-talk. Those are the things that I think would fit more into that category, that you could explain a lot of that away as just being quite self-aware. But my experience of it has been very much that it hasn't really come from me, it's come from this external source.
So let me ask my last question. It's a question on the secret list, the one that I do not share with my co-host. So
I knew it. Get this list.
There's always the secret list. Dale thinks, hey, you went off script that time. And I say, no, I didn't. I went off your script. So I'm a polemicist. I don't mind owning that. In fact, tomorrow I will be guest hosting on a podcast called Ask an Atheist Anything. And I will be talking to Matthew Taylor about using the tool of polemic. So just a preview of that. I define polemic as the ability to ridicule the ridiculous. I think it's very important for us as a society to know the difference between the rational and the irrational, the reasonable and the ridiculous. And I think that comedians do society a great good because they help shine a light on things that we should laugh at. And sometimes they get it wrong because maybe some things they think we should laugh at are not, in fact, things we should laugh at. But they help shine that light and hold that conversation. I think that's very important, not to hold terribly serious conversations about things that are truly ridiculous. And when a society forgets what is and isn't ridiculous, I think a society is somewhat lost. So that said, I know that you and I will have some disagreements on what is reasonable and what is ridiculous. But just as a final level setting thing for me, do you find anything that a Christian might claim in terms of, God told me to do this, or, God did this in my life? Do you ever find any of those claims ridiculous? Is there anything that you, Natalie Collins, would personally catalog as they said this and that's ridiculous to me?
Yes, all the time. So I this guy, we were at a barbecue. There's a guy who announced that God had forever healed him and he was never going to be ill ever again. And I haven't seen him for years, but I did see him a few years later, and I was really tempted to be like, so have you been ill? Because I knew, do you know, when you just like, but I just thought I didn't want to rub it in his face that, he was in like week 6 or something of never being ill again. And I don't know, like, I think, being told that they've had a vision of waterfalls was, there's all the time. I think Christians, there's a whole, like, so much problematic and toxic culture. A lot of the stuff that we think God has told us are like, traditional gender roles. Like there's a book, I want to say, it's not Wayne Grudem or John Piper, but it's one of their lots. And his wife wrote a book, or said in a book, that she felt God, called her to give up her own ministry totally to support her husband because, I don't know, it was awful. She was kind of sinning to have any desires to serve God out of her own stuff, or there's another woman who started to question whether feminists might have a point and then realized it was the spirit of Jezebel in her life, like so I suppose, like, particularly in the area of work that I most strongly, like, I spend my life like encountering people who justify all sorts of really toxic stuff by saying God thinks that they're right. So, like, absolutely, I think there is a lot of ridiculousness out there. I've been on the receiving end of it, both as somebody who was, in the middle of really, really terrible stuff, and the sort of stuff people say to you. I believed that God told me that I should stay with my ex-husband for a long time because I just thought, well, that's what God wants me to do, and I thought God was telling me to. So I have personally experienced believing God telling me stuff that wasn't God. But actually, once I encountered, like, I wouldn't say that was before I encountered God properly for myself. And since then, the experience that I've had where God has spoken to me, those things have had really healthy and positive fruit. So I think the fruit of these things is part of it. But yeah, I think people convince themselves God has said stuff to them all the time. So I'm genuinely not. And I am quite cynical, when any time I go to a meeting and somebody's like, oh, I feel I've got a word that somebody's going to be healed, and I'm immediately like, what have you though? So, so I'm not, as I say all this, I'm sure that you might be, people listening might be like, she's mad. And, like I'm actually quite cynical when it comes to the idea that God is saying stuff to people. So, and I suppose that's one of the reasons why I suppose I even more convinced when God talks to me, because I'm not the sort of person who just like willingly just takes on stuff and just thinks that, I'm not somebody who really is very open to the supernatural in some senses, but that's in some ways why I'm a bit more convinced. as counter, as contradictory as that might sound.
Natalie Collins, it has been an absolute joy.
It's
Thank you
great.
for coming onto the show, and I I will I will speak for myself. I think I speak for both of us when I say we would love to have you back. I've been telling a lot of people we'll let's see if we can maybe reconnoiter in the summer as summer approaches, and I expect our
Right.
calendars filling up. Maybe you'd be willing to come back in the fall.
I would love to.
That would be fantastic. Dale, who do we have on deck next week?
So next week is Lydia McGrew is coming
Oh
to talk about the
my.
Gospels. And what did you say?
I said, oh my.
Yes, yes, I was great. Tony Costa recommended that she'd be a good contact for me to reach out. So she's going to be giving her take, which is slightly different than one of our previous guests, Mike Lacona, on the issue of the reliability of the Gospels. So yeah, that's going to be a great topic. I'm looking forward to that.
So when do we have the Lydia McGrew Mike Lacona cage match? That's the one I'm waiting for.
That might actually be I might, yeah, maybe if Lydia enjoys her time and would like to come back on, maybe I could reach out to both Mike and Lydia, at some point in the future, and we could actually have them do a discussion on it. So yeah, that's a good idea.
Fun, fun, fun. But it would never be more fun. It could only be as fun as the time we have had with Natalie Collins. So thank you.
Natalie, before you go, if you did want to come back, did you have any ideas as to topics, just sort of general topics that you would like to discuss with us, or you're just
Um,
up for anything?
I'm really up for discussing anything. As you can probably guess, I have an opinion on everything. There's very
Nice.
little I don't have an opinion on. I think once I got asked to be on the radio to talk about like having female Santas in a parade, and I was like, that was the one time that I was like, I don't really know whether I have anything to say.
Yes.
So,
No
generally,
female Santas. Okay.
I just like I couldn't really work out what I would say, but generally I'm up for having conversations about whatever. My I've got teenagers, so having some I'd be happy to kind of chat about like being a Christian parent and how like raising kids, and that might be something that might be of interest in terms of from an atheist point of view, and like actually should we raise kids with faith if we're people of faith, and I don't know.
Child abuse type
Oh
thing.
boy,
Or...
do I have some thoughts on that? But I'm not a parent, so I don't know that anyone should care about my thoughts on that. So
But yeah, I'll have a think if anything else emerges. But it may be that as a result of this, when you go away and kind of think about it, that there's stuff that emerges that you think, oh, like that'd be a really useful thing. Yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about kind of sexual ethics and faith and some of the really problematic stuff around kind of purity culture. Yeah, and my own view is that pornography and purity culture are two sides of the same coin. So I'd be happy to talk about that. It might be a bit contentious, but yeah, I'm really up for chatting
Natalie,
about.
am I reading you correctly when I say you enjoy the contentious stuff?
Oh, I love contentious stuff. I literally, there's very little that I'm not up for kind of debating or discussing.
Awesome. I love that attitude. Perfect. Yeah. Well, we'll definitely be in touch. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed having you on the show. So yeah, we'll
Right.
organize.
I feel a bit bad because I think during the recording I called you Doug, but I didn't mean to. It's just that on my Skype it
Wait,
says
did
D
you just
on.
call me? You just called me Doug. Okay,
Yeah.
you're not coming back. It's
I
over.
think it's Doug and Dale, but it's because on the Skype it says DG, and so my brain went, his name's Doug. Even though
The recording is still going.
Oh,
People.
yeah. That's okay. Well, I'll forgive you this one.
A good editor would edit this out, but as we've determined.
All right. So thank you everyone for listening. We're still recording. Natalie is a great guest to have. She's up for getting involved in these and having these real.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Doug, for your participation.
We,
And it looks like Doug has
Your host,
roboted
Doug.
out. So,
yeah, absolutely. So have a good week.
bye-bye, everybody.
All right. Bye bye.